Falling in love in the traditional sense goes something like this. You meet somebody and you connect. You really vibe with them and you both are over the moon. You could spend all night talking, hours on the phone, having adventures, enjoying each other's company, sharing stories, and it's almost this high. In fact, limerence is a dopaminergic high, and some people get confused about that and start chasing the dopamine rush, the hormone rush. But it's actually the first part of falling in love. And as you are making plans, continuing to make plans and starting to dream about this person, to wonder about what a life would look like with them, boom, something happens. You have your first moment. And depending on who you're working with and their level of shadow work that has been completed, this can be just a slight little bump in the road. It kind of raises your eyebrow. You're like, okay, that's a little weird. Or it could be a full 180 or even a 90-degree turn where you're like, wait a second, is this a red flag? What happens is that the limerence phase is really marked by connecting with this version of somebody that isn't fully complete. It's like taking an old-fashioned Polaroid image of just a snapshot of their personality. And it's often the best part of them because they're under the hormonal influence too. They're excited too. They are in the clouds too. And so what you see is it's not really an artifice because it's not an illusion, it's not a mask. It's the highlight, the snapshot of the best self that has so much optimism and so much hope, just like you do. And then thunder strikes. And you start to see a different part of the person. What I find interesting is that sometimes you'll actually see the person morph into their unhealed personality characteristics or their behavioral program. And some of the most striking examples that I've seen are when children, the inside child, starts to come out. I remember being with a soul partner, and as we were going through this process, falling in love, I got to see several different fragments in them and vice versa. And what was fascinating is that I have the clearest memory of cooking for them. And while they were waiting, spinning around in the bar stool and really connecting with that inner child, which in the moment I found endearing. And when I served them this food, because I love to show affection through cooking, and it was this not very adventurous, but this unusual combination, because they were still connected to their inner child that was coming out to play. They said, yuck, what is this? And I said, it's honey, black pepper, and manchego cheese. And they said, yuck, I'm not going to eat that. And all of a sudden that endearing, I didn't honestly think it was that unusual, but for their palate, it was apparently. And all of a sudden that endearing quality sort of reversed in my experience of reality, where all of a sudden I saw them as though I was their mother. And they were my child, but we were in a romantic relationship. And I immediately started feeling uncomfortable because it felt like all of a sudden they were wired back to the past and couldn't see me and wanted to play out some dynamic that I wasn't sure I was signing up for, because I had experiences like that before in different settings where it just wasn't an itch that I was looking to scratch. So it gave me a little bit of pause. And then as we would progress into the shadow wounds, what I would observe is that they would hold me responsible for these unhealed mother wounds that they had. Like if I didn't remind them to do something, or if I didn't answer their questions, it was really as though they had a central parental wound that needed to be healed. And they were looking for that healing in the romantic partnerships. I have never seen a grown man morph into an adolescent the way I did with that partner. And I have had my own experiences, by the way, in a different soul partnership. I had my own experiences transforming into a child version of myself. In fact, somebody even told me once, and it was absolutely appropriate. They told me, "You have a little girl inside of you." And I was like, "I do, and she's hurt." And it took me some time on my own shadow journey to work through my tantrums and my self-expressions. And I had partnerships where I could do that, actually, where I had a safe space to regress. And it was actually a big part of my healing journey, and one that I'm very grateful for, but that I have outgrown. And so when I was faced with this prospect of re-entering into a romantic union with an important soul connection and helping them to work through their adolescent wounds, I found myself unable to do so, probably because I had done that personal work and had worked those pieces out with other partners. But what's fascinating to me is that when we negotiate these romantic unions, we don't always talk about this, and we don't always know what we're signing up for. And the partner that regressed with me, that had the mother wound, also had early, very early, like I think teenage years, sensitivity to rejection, and had these unhealed moments of anger and rage, actual rage. I remember being in a private moment with them, and they sort of transformed into this rageful person just for a flash of a moment, because they perceived that I rejected them. And as we would progress, I would see more of that rage-filled person that completely became unhinged and accused me of being just like them, meaning the early experiences that they had. That was more of a challenging scenario to break away from, because their emotional regulation abilities were not as developed as I would hope for somebody that was feeling that intense experience of anger. And so when we are in the limerence phase, we often don't know where we're going with somebody. And as a result, we don't know how to look after ourselves. And so one of the easiest ways that you can see if somebody is going to regress is observe when you set boundaries. I love this one now because what it shows you is somebody's tolerance to you taking care of your own needs, very often at the expense of something that they want from you: time, attention, affection. And people who have unhealed rejection and abandonment wounds actually have a very hard time with this, and you will observe this very early on. Another telltale sign is if you fully express yourself and all of your opinions, all of your emotions. And recently, I've actually been experimenting with doing so completely honestly and transparently, and inviting other people to have honest and transparent conversations. And what you'll find is that people who have trouble in relationships will not give you a safe space to express, or will actually lie about their true emotional experience. And so on the surface, it can look like that everything's okay and that you're having a nice constructive conversation. But when you are awakened to energy and have the sensitivity to the shared emotional experience that most heightened spiritual people have, regardless of whether or not they identify as an empath, what you will observe is that people will misrepresent their actual emotions because they have, I believe, been misguided to believe that emotional regulation is emotional suppression. And so what you will feel is that people will have a very intense reaction, and then they'll put a lid on it, and they'll come to the conversation table as though everything is okay, and it's not. And in the beginning, when people are experiencing limerence, those early stages of falling in love, you tend to overlook these details because everybody's showing up to the party in their best, most excited, most optimistic self. And what happens is that as you tap into their shadows, and as you start to poke around in their treasure box of wounds and former experiences, that ability to keep everything under the covers and show up to the conversation table like everything's okay deteriorates over time. Let's just call it like it is. And it's not that they're trying to misrepresent themselves unless they have any sort of disordered personality. But for the most part, most people are normal. And they're trying their best. They're absolutely trying their best. And so when you have the extra hit of dopamine, it's a lot easier to regulate your emotions. It's a lot easier to think that everything's going to work out okay. But when those extra hormones and extra neurotransmitters start to diminish, what you find is that people are a lot less patient. People are a lot less giving sometimes. People are a lot less sensitive to hearing you out sometimes, not all the time. And so it can be this morphing of a person that may at some point be pushed to an edge that you don't know in the beginning that you're going to go to. So when you are attuned to these two practices, what you'll find is that your intuition will give you kind of moments and to say like, I'm not so sure about that. Raise an eyebrow. Or in more urgent cases, where you might go down to the depths of a hell realm with somebody, you might observe a 90-degree turn or even 180. Is that a red flag? Probably. And when you look at the whole picture, you start to get a sense of what you're really dealing with. Because when you start to enter into regression, sometimes it's cute and it's fun and it's funny. And sometimes it is hair-raising. Let's just put it like that. And some of those karmic connections that lead you into the shadow journey, which I'll have a separate episode on another time, some of them have a lot of work that they need to heal. And relationships are often the vehicle for growth and transformation. And when you're working with a partner that is dedicated to certain principles like honesty or integrity or aligned with higher consciousness ideals, then what you observe is that you can work on it together. And that is a beautiful, beautiful vehicle for growth for both partners, especially when you are with somebody that has a complementary wound. And so, for example, when I regressed into various states of my childhood wounds, I was with partners who also had childhood wounds around those same ages. And so we would swap roles, taking temper tantrums and feeling completely at home and at ease and almost amused by it because we were well matched and well paired. And likewise, when you start to outgrow those wounds and those regression periods, you're better paired. You naturally are repelled. That's a better way to put it. You naturally are repelled by people who still have those wounds. And that is an indication that you are moving on to the next phase of your journey. If you are still magnetized to somebody who has a regression point, then that communicates to you that you likely have a complementary regression point that is either unacknowledged, operating under your conscious awareness, so in your shadow, or is waiting to be discovered. And this is why in my client work, I actually advise people to stay with the partners, if it makes sense, and not every partnership does, but to stay with the partners that are actually triggering your wounds and to work on it live, not in the relationship necessarily, unless it is set up that way, but in our client work, and then to go to the relationship with a different behavioral template to actually shift that relationship out of the loops, because oftentimes they can get caught in these cycles of never-ending triggers and responses and actions, and then triggers, responses, and actions. And so when you understand the regression purpose, then you can navigate these relationships a lot more smoothly. If you feel called to work together on your regression wounds, or your triggers and responses in your relationship, feel free to reach out to me, sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com. Okay, we'll talk soon.